Tonight, we want to lay out some new alarming details about Russia's brutal war against the Ukrainian people. We're going to start with new warning signs of the Kremlin considering the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. Now, U.S. intelligence believes that senior Russian generals have discussed how and when to deploy one. This classified report was described to CNN by multiple sources who have read it. There is debate on how seriously to take this intelligence. Is it further sign of Russian desperation and cause for real concern, or are these discussions being taken out of context? On CNN earlier tonight, top White House national security official John Kirby reacted to the latest U.S. intelligence report.
There's lots of levels of concern, of heightened concern about what's going on in Ukraine right now that gives us cause to continue to closely monitor as best we can Russia's nuclear capabilities.
Now, the intelligence report says that Vladimir Putin was not part of these talks, but Putin has publicly dangled the prospect of using a nuclear device for months. Today, Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs put out a statement, perhaps to try to ease fears that it remains Kremlin policy to only use nuclear arms in a defensive response, declaring, quote, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Also today, Putin announced he will once again abide by a deal to allow vital grain exports from Ukraine's safe passage in the Black Sea, which would be a welcome reversal to those who fear a global hunger crisis. Ukraine and Russia account for nearly a third of the world's wheat exports. Here's the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations on CNN this morning.
Clearly, Russia was finally convinced that they needed to continue this. They can't stand in the way of feeding the entire world.
But Putin is also threatening to pull out of that deal, again, if he feels Ukraine uses access to the Black Sea for any military purposes. Now, these announcements would be welcome if you take the Kremlin at its word, but we have all witnessed so many moments where the Kremlin says one thing and then does the exact opposite, whether insisting they would never invade Ukraine, or they will allow safe passage for refugees and won't harm them at all, or promising to allow wheat exports and then going back on that pledge. So while we all hope today's proclamations prove accurate, we're not confident that will be the case. What we are confident about is the continued Russian atrocities we're seeing on the ground in Ukraine. Tonight's CNN's Clarissa Ward is going to bring you new evidence of these horrors as she follows investigators who are tasked with looking for cases of rape and other sexual violence inside of Kherson, a region recently freed from Russian occupation. It sadly reinforces what an independent United Nations investigation team found. Rape and torture, sometimes the victims were children, some as young as 4. And at times, families of the victims were forced to watch. The head of a human rights organization which this year shared the Nobel Peace Prize warns that many of these crimes will surely go unpunished. No accountability. But here in the U.S., the Justice Department created a new division in June to investigate these Russian atrocities, these war crimes. And there's now a bipartisan push to change U.S. laws so that it will be easier to prosecute Russians for these horrific deeds in U.S. courts, should these Russians ever enter the United States. Now, it's hard to believe, but there are some in Russia who actually argue that Putin has not been brutal enough. And we want to shine a light tonight on a mercenary army that is emerging from the shadows. Let me introduce you to Yevgeny Prigozhin. Prigozhin is a Russian oligarch best known as Putin's chef, and for good reason. His restaurants and catering company have literally hosted dinners attended by Putin and other world leaders, including then-President George W. Bush. But Prigozhin is also known for serving up bodies. Just a few weeks ago, Prigozhin admitted to founding the Wagner Group in 2014. You might have heard whispers about Wagner. It used to be a private mercenary group that operated entirely in the shadows. But in recent years, CNN has tracked Wagner operatives in Ukraine, Libya, Sudan, Mozambique, Mali, and Syria. Clarissa gained access to a Wagner training base in the Central African Republic.
For Russia, this is a straightforward bargain. They provide the weapons and the training, and in return, they get access to the country's natural resources. And in the process, they hope to reassert themselves as a major player in this region.
The Wagner Group has a gruesome reputation and is linked to any number of human rights abuses, including tortures and beheadings. Top U.S. officials have consistently warned about the Wagner Group's brutal tactics.
Poor governance, exclusion, and corruption inherent in weak democracies makes them more vulnerable to extremist movements as well as to foreign interference. That includes the Kremlin-backed Wagner Group, which exploits instability to pillage resources and commit abuses with impunity.
Now, Russia's war on Ukraine has thrust Prigozhin and Wagner into the spotlight. Ukrainian officials estimate at least 5,000 Wagner mercenaries are fighting alongside Russian forces in Ukraine. Where are they finding so many soldiers? Well, a CNN investigation found that Wagner is recruiting murderers and drug dealers from prisons, with a promise that if they survive the war in Ukraine, they will be granted shorter sentences or even amnesty. Now, these aren't former soldiers who happen to be imprisoned. They are men who are hardened, brutal criminals. This is what one prisoner told CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh.
If it's real, then I'm all for it. It's either be in prison for 9 years or get out in 6 months if you are lucky. But that's if you are lucky.
Prigozhin himself recently did something that would have once seemed unfathomable. According to U.S. officials, Prigozhin directly confronted Vladimir Putin about his belief that Russian generals are mismanaging the war in Ukraine and that more aggressive tactics need to be used.